Do you think Japanese automakers still need to rethink their supply chain? And some of the smaller companies, I mean, 15% is going to be huge for companies like Subaru or Mazda. Do you think it's going to accelerate consolidation in the Japanese auto industry?
It's possible. It depends, though, on what you mean exactly by consolidation. So, for example, Subaru and Mazda, as you mentioned, they do face a significantly higher burden. They do, however, have an advantage in the fact that they're relatively close and have strong ties to Toyota. And so Subaru already has a manufacturing base in the US of its own in Indiana, and then Mazda has a joint plant with Toyota. So Toyota's heft and financial scale should allow it to more easily expand investment in the US and increase production. So if Mazda and Subaru were operating completely on their own, obviously the burden would be significantly higher for them, especially in the long term. In the short term, I do think they will struggle this year if the taxes remain even at this 15% level. But the fact that they do have ties to Toyota does mean that they have options when you start to look out 3 to 5 years, say. And then, as you mentioned, the question is, do they simply continue the current relationship and perhaps just establish more joint plants together to establish more flexible manufacturing? Or does it actually create enough pressure where perhaps they may actually become a more formal part of the Toyota group with Capital Tires becoming subsidiaries? I wouldn't expect the latter to happen on a short-term time frame. However, it is certainly something for them to consider when you start looking towards the end of the decade, perhaps.
Yeah, and how does this factor in South Korea competitors to these Japanese automakers, obviously fighting for the same market in the United States, trying to keep their market share? And we've got this news flash breaking just moments ago that South Korea's delegation, the finance minister and trade minister, not being able to get to the trade negotiation because Scott Bessent, U.S. Treasury Secretary, had some urgent schedules. So talks are being canceled, or I should say delayed for now. This is not going to bode well for South Korean corporates, especially the auto majors. And I would wonder, would this kind of a setup somehow incentivize the South Korean automakers to keep looking for their supply chain rerouting options and will they have to lower their export prices in the end because of this geopolitical uncertainty?
Well, to begin with, I think in terms of the overall competitive situation, I think it's important to be aware that over the last decade or so, after the financial crisis, actually, a lot of the Japanese automakers did commit more towards significantly more localized production, and this is something that they've been working on for more than 10 years, almost 20 years now. So they have made significant progress, especially in the US, in terms of localizing production. This is not really an approach that Hyundai, for example, really adopted, and they, partly perhaps due to the free trade agreement that South Korea signed with the US long ago, I think they relied much more heavily on exports, which were quite profitable for them. So they are significantly behind in terms of where they are and also any sort of progress that they might have made in reducing or at least not increasing the trade deficit that the US faced, which is a little bit different from the situation that Japan has faced, and possibly, together with Japan's overall scale, may have benefited them slightly in terms of being able to negotiate not necessarily a good deal, but perhaps slightly better than some other countries have managed to get. So the question for Korea is the speed with which they can actually localize production in the US, because it does take time, and it will require very, very significant commitments in terms of capital investment. But then there also is the question of exactly what they do with domestic capacity, because they were also quite reliant on China. And that market is increasingly being, shares increasingly being eaten by their local domestic manufacturers. So we do think that they're in a much, much tougher position. As for the export prices that you mentioned, one thing I flag is that I think Japanese manufacturers in general tend to perhaps have overpriced some of their export prices in the past. So they perhaps had leeway to reduce some of those prices and simply shift where the profit was nominally being generated in terms of geographical centers. I don't know whether that's true for Korea, so that could affect the amount of flexibility that they have. But yeah, it would be one option if they want to try and reduce some of the impact, but I haven't checked on that as of now.